A good evening and a warm welcome to guests, speakers and members of SEJ. My name's Olu and I'll be hosting today's webinar. For those that are not aware, the aim of SEJ was to bring together people who want to challenge social and environmental justices in their own localities. And we've deliberately chosen topics for a series of webinar sessions that are important factors in the work to challenge injustices. SEJ has formed a diverse committee with a wealth and breadth of experience, with representatives spread across regions and localities across the UK. SEJ aims to act as a conduit for both groups and individuals and a catalyst to connecting fair, coherent and just policy. What SEJ is really interested in is where the good practice is happening in this area, what we can learn from what is existing, how we can amplify that work, but also bring about improvements that benefit all. We're really delighted that you've all been able to join us today and shown an interest in this topic, because it's one that's really important to all of us, as we were all impacted to various degrees by transport policies, both on a local and national level. Today's session has been put together to present SEJ's transport policy document, and we're joined by a panel of speakers from the SEJ committee to discuss and explore the challenges people face in relation to transport and to put forward a potential strategy to improve transport policies. The panel will start to look at how policies can be developed to benefit all members of our respective communities. Our speakers tonight have gained specialist knowledge and experiences that have informed their work in this area, so we're particularly delighted to have them with us tonight. So just a bit of housekeeping before we start the session. We're recording today's session to support the development of SEJ's ongoing programme of webinar sessions. We'll provide a recording of the webinar for the benefit of those people who haven't been able to join us tonight. Subtitles are available through Zoom's own speech-to-text transcription, and you can access these by clicking on the closed caption button in the toolbar. And we've invited questions for the panel from guests this evening. Live questions will also be collected, and if we have time, we'll ask speakers tonight to give their thoughts on these towards the end of the session. You can send questions by sending us a DM in the chat. And so, now, I'll just do a quick introduction to our speakers this evening, first of which will be David Smith. So David's also known by his Twitter handle, Little Ninja UK, which he created in 2016 as part of a campaign to reduce air pollution exposure for the children disproportionately impacted by vehicle emissions on London's community main roads and red routes. After buying a £6,000 scientific grade air pollution monitor and mounting it at a bus stop on the South Circular Road, David shocked Londoners with the results that confirmed children are being exposed to toxic air that stunts their lung growth, increasing their risk of asthma and shortening their lives. After LTNs imposed as a COVID emergency response worsened exposure for those most at risk, David became more determined than ever to highlight the injustices of air pollution, and is part of the SEJ subcommittee creating a transport strategy for a just city. Our next speaker will be Stella Sawyer. Stella has lived and worked in several London boroughs since commencing her nursing career in 1983. She's currently working with people living with long-term health conditions, helping them manage the challenges of their everyday lives and connecting them with activities in local communities to reduce the social isolation that so many experiencing long-term ill health feel. Stella has lived in Lambeth since 2004. Stella will be joined by Jane Alashevsky, an SEJ member from Lewisham, and the parent of a child with autism, and she set up a Facebook group called Lewisham Healthy Streets for All, campaigning for inclusivity in her local LTN. Our last speaker will be John Stewart. John has worked and campaigned tirelessly on transport for 40 years and on noise for the last 25 years. He's chaired a number of local and national organisations, has written several publications, including the book Why Noise Matters. He lives in Stockwell, South London. So without further ado, we will hand over to our guests, and I hope that all guests enjoy the session and leave with some food for thought. So without further ado, I'll hand over to David.
Thank you so much. Transport justice, where do we start? I think the burning issues, topics right now are around vehicle miles driven, traffic congestion, vehicle emissions, purely because that feeds into the whole issues around the climate crisis, climate emergency, and around the national health emergency we have around air pollution and the damage it's doing to public health. it's been an interesting journey, my last 6 years. It seemed we were making a lot of progress in this area 6 years ago. Rosamond Deborah, with the fantastic campaigning she was doing after the death of her beautiful daughter, Ella. And, you know, so many invites for her, so many presentations, really bringing light and a focus onto the fact that it is, you know, the children who are on and near these main roads like the South Circular, who are, you know, exposed to air pollution that we know can reduce lung capacity by up to 14%, shorten lives, but it can even take lives, as we know. In fact, it's around 12 children every year who are dying from asthma, and we know 1 in 4 children in the UK suffering from asthma is due to air pollution. So, you know, as you say, about 4 years ago, 6 years ago, we were making real progress. Around 4 years ago, we were at the point where I was joining Rosamond at many of these events at City Hall. You know, even invites from Extinction Rebellion, as they're starting to realize climate change, air pollution, 2 sides of the same coin, and really starting to bring some focus on the fact that it is, you know, disproportionately the poor and people of color who are suffering the social injustice of air pollution. And it's a social injustice element because they realize who is most responsible for, you know, these kind of vehicle miles being driven and air pollution. It is the most affluent society. They own more cars, they drive further, and they have more diesel vehicles. And it often is 2 or 3 per household. So when we look at that and we kind of know who's responsible, you look at their lifestyle as well, and it's just the way it is. They're getting Deliveroo's, they're getting, you know, Just Eats, they're getting Ocado delivery, same-day deliveries for a number of different organizations, Amazon deliveries, and, you know, it still is mostly diesel vans. Demand for other things around construction and so on and so forth. So we've got all these vans, diesel vans, trucks, lorries, filling up our roads, and we know that, like, the red routes are 5% of the strategic network and yet take 35% of the traffic. And so disproportionately, air pollution will be very, very high on these roads. And yet, because they're red routes, this is the bus routes, who are most likely to get the bus. And again, it is the poor, it is again the people of color. It's more women than men, people with disabilities. It's a great way to travel because the buses have that accessibility, unlike, you know, many of the tubes and train stations. So we already see this kind of social injustice, this impact of air pollution. And when we understand around that, and we have people like Professor Jonathan Grigg explaining that on a day-to-day basis, our greatest air pollution exposure is how much time we spend on and near main roads. And the Mayor for London's own research from City Hall many years ago explained that children who attend schools on main roads or high prevalence of wheeze, higher prevalence of asthma, and leading on to up to 14% reduced lung capacity. It also impacts on neurological development, mental health, dementia, and the list goes on. And, you know, as we find out more around this aspect and we look at CO2 from, you know, the extra vehicle miles being driven, particularly in petrol, and then carbon dioxide, CO2, NO2, nitrogen dioxide from the diesel vehicles, you know, we've got both of these, and then you've got the particulate matter, PM2.5, from the brake wear, tyre wear, road surface wear, the little bits of, you know, rubber, metal, oil, plastic, so small that it can get straight deep into the lungs, into the bloodstream, and go wherever blood goes, including past the blood-brain barrier and past the into the placenta. So it's also affecting the unborn child. And, you know, it's a frightening place to be in, while we kind of recognize that, you know, we rely on cars, we rely on vehicles for, you know, to what we need to do in society. It drives the economy. But at the same time, you know, last year, it was like 80 hours in London on average, drivers are spending in congested traffic. You know, the impact it has to our economy is a negative impact, as well as to health, as well as to climate. So, you know, there is a a real push then to say, yes, we must find solutions to reduce vehicle miles driven. And so we say, okay, well, which are the important vehicle miles that we need to reduce? Whose vehicle miles are we going to reduce? You know, who drives for a living? Who's driving unnecessary journeys? You know, how many of these journeys are short journeys? How many of these are medium and long journeys? We know that those affluent are driving those medium and long journeys, happy not necessarily to drive the short journeys. Many cycle. Often you see those cars with bikes on the roof going to somewhere where they're going to cycle. And many cycling commuting. That changed with the pandemic, where more people are working from home forever. And we kind of note that actually, you know, the increase that we expected in cycling during the pandemic we saw, and then it kind of dipped back down and is now around the same area it was pre-pandemic. And some DFC are actually saying in some areas it's actually lower. And yet we've had a huge amount of infrastructure put in, a huge amount of funding put in to increase cycling and walking. And, you know, we need to look at, well, has that been money well spent? You know, has that increased the amount of cycling? Now, some will argue, yes, it's increased cycling. And then we look at, you know, like Deliveroo, and look at the thousands of workers who are now working and they're cycling 30, 40 hours a week. And you kind of balance that off with, you know, the fact that less people are cycling into the office and more are kind of cycling locally. And, you know, we start looking at that, but also, you know, we'll talk about this later, I think, in terms of the, you know, how money could be better spent in terms of cycling. But I think in terms of the injustice side, what really shouts to me was 3 years ago, you know, 3.5 years ago, as we kind of leading into the pandemic, we kind of knew where the issues were. We knew it was the side roads, you know, the most affluent society, and we had to tackle that. And it seemed that we were heading that right direction before the pandemic hit. But once the pandemic hit, the kind of emergency measures for the pandemic allowed people to say, actually, you know what, I don't want to change my lifestyle. I'm quite happy owning cars. I'm quite happy driving. It's not my car that's the problem. It's not my journeys that's the problem. It's other people. And if I close my road to traffic, then that will save me, that will protect me, that will give me room for social distancing, even though it was very, very clear that those who are suffering the most, those who are most at risk, were on the main roads because of respiratory pandemic. Those who had already been in areas of high air pollution were more likely to be infected, more likely to end up in intensive care, and more likely to die. For a black man, 3 times more likely than a white man to die of COVID. So there was the opportunity to say, actually, we need to reduce air pollution on main roads. We need to reduce air pollution for those who are most at risk. And, you know, I think it's really important just to mention, when we say main roads, these main roads are residential. These main roads are often the hubs of society. These are high streets. These are our red routes. These are where our schools are, hospitals are, care homes. This is where people shop. This is where people meet and greet and go to restaurants and bars. You know, these are where people live and breathe. So the idea of closing side roads filled with cars, high car ownership, and pushing traffic onto the community roads, onto where, you know, a vast number of people are there, where actually more people will be not just walking and scooting and waiting for buses, but also cycling, to actually then increase air pollution for those who are least responsible, but already most at risk, in order to reduce traffic and air pollution for those most responsible and least at risk. For us to have a transport policy that does that, there's something wrong, fundamentally wrong. And when you look at it and you think, well, who's making these decisions? Who's around the table making decisions? You know, and then with the best will in the world, they may think that they can come up with solutions for, you know, a single mum with 2 kids trying to make that school run, or solutions for someone with, you know, serious disabilities, or carers for the elderly. But actually, if around the table tend to be the same people, which are affluent, non-disabled men, and sometimes women, then you kind of get the policies that we keep on getting, and you get a continuation of the social injustice. And I think, you know, that's where we start talking about transport injustice, social and environmental injustice. And that's where we are today, where we actually do need to now start putting a spotlight on this, recognizing it for what it is. You know, it could be the best intentions, but it's wrong, and start actually having this conversation around transport justice. My area, obviously, I'm looking at those most impacted on, you know, these community roads, and the impact it's having on poor people, people of color, and on children. But it's much broader than that. And I'm going to be handing over to Stella very shortly so that she can broaden on that very subject. But it is time for us to have a good conversation and start talking around transport justice. And I think the work we've done so far with this, and it's something that we really do need to continue building on. I think we can make a real difference to London and the UK. Okay, thank you, Ollie. We'll pass it over to Stella.
Thank you, Ollie, and thank you, David. So David has already touched upon some of the groups protected under the Equality Act 2010. And I just thought this was a good time to remind ourselves that this act was designed to promote a fair and more equal society and to protect individuals with certain characteristics from unfair treatment and discrimination. Characteristics protected under the Act include sex, age, race, and disability, and it is disability that I'm going to focus on tonight. Local authorities are legally obliged to complete equality impact assessments for all their policies and policy changes. But sadly, too many councils seem to regard these assessments as a mere formality and just another hoop to jump through, rather than a way of increasing social justice within their policy structure. We at SEJ, Social and Environmental Justice, recognise that the opportunities for people with disabilities and mobility impairments, which can of course include older people, to access their workplace, their communities and local amenities can be limited by so many different factors. And that includes uneven, badly maintained pavements, cluttered with bins, weeds, hire bikes and cars. Likewise, badly maintained busy roads that are very difficult to cross. Cramped buses reached only via floating bus stops, with cycle lanes running through between the bus stop and the pavement. Non-existent or non-functioning lifts at many train stations, and lack of staff to assist at many transport hubs. The feedback that's been given to the government on the national consultation regarding train ticket office closures has demonstrated how the transport needs of disabled people are often overlooked. Low traffic neighbourhoods can also adversely impact people with limited mobility who rely on cars, and that might be their own or other people's. And many councils have failed to provide blue badge holder access through all LTN barriers. And even when exemptions are granted, extra time spent in cars on slow moving, congested roads surrounding the LTNs can be very anxiety provoking and exacerbate certain conditions such as chronic pain and fatigue. The cumulative effect of these limiting factors can result in increased social isolation and, as we say in the health service, deconditioning, as disabled people and people with mobility impairments who understandably just don't feel that they can leave the house, face leaving the house to face these sometimes overwhelming challenges. Many SEJ members have reported that community consultations regarding transport and roads policies are mainly carried out online, which digitally excludes people without IT access, but also those who have cognitive difficulties and those whose first language is not English. SEJ advocates meaningful, inclusive consultation with all stakeholders, including disabled people and individuals with long-term health conditions, as well as their paid and unpaid carers and relatives, to formulate transport policies that protect and support the most vulnerable in our communities. I'm now going to hand over to Jane, who's going to talk about her experience as a parent of a child with a disability.
So I'm Jane Alashevsky. I live in Lewisham. My 12-year-old son has autism and I'm also autistic. Lewisham found a taxi to take him to school. Inner London has a severe shortage of specialist provision. So for his primary school, he had to go to school in Kent, travelling about 1.5 hours each way from our house, and now he attends a school in Sutton. He currently commutes about 3 hours a day. It's a very long journey for a 12-year-old with autism, but it's typical of the kinds of journeys young children with SEN have to make due to the lack of local provision. We think and hope that councils will put the needs of this vulnerable group first and foremost when closing roads, but this was not the case. We were not informed or consulted about the LTN by the council. No disability groups were informed or consulted. I only found out about the LTN because my friend sent me a link to the news about it in the local paper. I immediately emailed my council my concern about the impact on SEN transport. He ignored me. Due to this shortage of specialist places, SEN children travel huge distances to school, some as far as Cambridge. The road closure should really take this group of learners and their journeys into consideration. Before the LTN was implemented, I spoke to the borough's cycling lead, Josh Traynor. He promised to liaise with SEN Transport and other disabled children's services, but an FOI I've submitted revealed that he didn't do anything. He's since moved to Lambeth and has been promoted to head of transport strategy. During COVID, my son's school shut for about a year. He progressed socially and emotionally whilst he was away from his peers. The LTN came in just as my son was faced with a return to school. The SEN transport system was in chaos. The FOI I submitted shows that this is because they were not consulted about the LTN. Journey times doubled as a result. The service had to double the number of SEN minibuses to cope with the delayed journeys. They had previously shared taxi runs and the cost of these with other boroughs. They had to stop doing this and send children like my son alone in taxis at huge cost. So my son's journey to his primary school in a shared taxi had been about 90 minutes prior to the LTN. The local authority told me that the LTN was going to increase the journey to 2 hours each way. This breached statutory guidelines for journeys to school, and the local authority had to put him in his own taxi as a result. SEN school fees run to tens of thousands of pounds, but taxis, which need a driver and an escort, cost even more. Hence, the cost for SEN transport was catastrophic. SEN transport had no exemption to enter the LTN initially and were forced onto gridlock boundary roads. Parents reported harrowing stories about their autistic children trying to jump out of taxi windows in frustration. Head teachers of SEN schools reported whole year groups arriving late and distressed. Pre-COVID, the protocol was for a driver and an escort to meet the child at your house before the term began. This went out of the window during COVID. So you didn't get to meet the taxi driver. My son was 9 at the time. In his first week back at school, due to the sort of chaotic state of the SEN transport system, when the LTN came in, he had 3 different crews come to pick him up, and he did not know any of them. And one day that I remember very clearly, the taxi service forgot about him. I only realised that they'd forgotten about him because I'm sort of very on the ball, and I kind of called, and I realised that nobody actually had him on their sort of road of picking him up. So he was stuck in the middle of nowhere. You can't walk there, you can't go by public transport, and they don't have a car. And I just remember sitting at the table crying in frustration. I don't own a car because, you know, for a number of years we thought it's not good for the environment. So we tried to sort of manage without one. And my local authority is sort of saying, you know, it's closing the roads, you sort of shouldn't own cars, it's bad for the environment. But actually, putting us in a situation where really it's almost irresponsible if we don't have one, because, you know, we can't sort of manage to get our children safely to school and back. Very unfair. My husband and son are asthmatic. Their asthma has worsened due to our location on a sacrificial road. I've written to all local politicians, but they do not care that my autistic child is being given asthma, another lifelong condition, on top of his autism. Since the LTN was introduced, asthma rates have increased across Lewisham. Lewisham now has London's second highest rate of paediatric asthma cases. Research reveals that air pollution increases the likelihood of babies being born with autism. It also worsens the symptoms of autism and ADHD. Lewisham has the highest rate of autism, I believe, in the UK. Yet Lewisham persists with their LTN regardless. They have no real insight into the health impact on its residents. They did not provide before and after data for all boundary roads. As I mentioned, the LTN came at huge financial cost to SEN Transport because the delays forced them to rent extra vehicles. They're recouping this cost by threatening parents that they won't get their school of choice unless they don't apply for transport. It's not a legal position, but the council have refused to back down. In the initial 6 months, SEN Transport and Blue Badge holders were not given exemption for Lewisham's LTN. The council only caved in and allowed this due to public pressure. However, despite getting exemption, my son's taxi has been fined 3 times. I've challenged the fines on the driver's behalf because I've got contacts with the council. I know how to do this, but it did take up my time. We have a severe shortage of SEN taxi drivers in Lewisham. As a result, many parents are having to do the school run to distant SEN schools themselves. Drivers are personally liable for the fines, and this is one reason they're quitting in droves. I've discovered that the council has quotas for providing SEN taxis with exemption, and these are far below the number of SEN taxis in the area. Why is this? Also found many taxi firms will not apply for exemption, and as a result, many SEN children still travel to school on the gridlock boundary roads, facing huge delays getting to school. This has actually been our case for the past year. Initially, no EQIA was done for Lewisham's LTN. An LTN was done about a year after the scheme came in as a result of public pressure. The EQIA found that the scheme disadvantaged disabled people and their support network. Despite this finding, the LTN was made permanent. No disabled groups were consulted for the EQIA. They were also not consulted for Lewisham's transport policy, which is very ableist, revolving around active travel. Lewisham have repeatedly told us that they could not do an EQIA for months because the LTN was a COVID emergency measure. However, Lewisham planned the LTN prior to COVID. I've also been told by Labour councillor that the LTN was not a COVID measure. Feels that they used the COVID emergency to try to sneak through the LTN without an EQIA. Where is the Equality Act in all of this? It seems to be missing in action. I approached our local MP, Vicky Foxcroft, about the EQIA. It's the Shadow Minister for Disability, and the fact that it discriminated against disabled people. Sadly, her response was that she wanted an LTN for her own area and couldn't wait to get one. She wasn't interested in the failings of our EQIA. We've been told that the LTN is funding freedom passes. However, after it was introduced, discretionary passes for disabled people were abandoned by Lewisham. Lewisham has no autism category for disabled freedom passes, hence autistic people previously applied for discretionary passes. This is no longer an option for them. Lewisham have raised millions through LTN fines. Where is the money going? It's certainly not being spent on disabled people's transport.
I think that was brilliant and very profound, Jane. So thank you for your input. And I think we'll definitely have some questions later on relating to your experiences. So thank you very much for your input tonight. With that, we'll hand over to John, who will talk a little bit about the policy paper.
Thanks very much, Olu. David, Stella and Jane have really quite eloquently expressed many of the problems we've got right now. But we're often asked, and rightly asked, well, we know the problems. What's your solution? And that's why we really put together this paper called Transport Justice. It sets out a framework of a policy solution, which we believe will cut congestion, air pollution, noise, road danger, emissions on our roads without unduly restricting people's ability to get about or the ability of freight to be delivered. Critical to this, we believe, is the main roads. David talked eloquently about the value of main roads. They are through routes. They're valuable to through traffic, to the essential freight traffic, to their often principal bus routes, but they're also, as David said, very often the heart of communities. They're community high streets. They're community high streets where people shop and walk and talk, where people live, where people go to school, go to the pub, go to the church, go to the mosque. There are many busy roads, which are also perhaps not traditional main roads where people live. But these main roads and these other roads, other busy roads, are places to be valued. They're places to be improved. They're places to be cherished. What they are not, and what LTNs made them, is a depository of other people's traffic. So how do we deal with the challenge of main roads and of these busy roads? I think we start with public transport. I think we start with cheaper public transport, better public transport, more accessible public transport, and more innovative public transport. In my view, trams have got an important role to play and underused in our towns and in our cities. There's also an important role for taxis and car sharing. But as Stella and Jane both said, in our report we say that front and central in all transport policy decision making needs to be accessibility and pedestrians, needs to be disabled people and people on foot. I won't repeat what Stella said, but she outlined the sort of measures that need to be in place for disabled people to move around, for pedestrians to feel safe. It's the reason why we oppose floating bus stops. But we also need to make cycling more attractive, and critically, make cycling more attractive to more people. The Bicycle Association said this: the male white cycling enthusiast niche has reached its natural limit. And we believe that's the case. And what we need is more equitable investment in cycling so that a more diverse range of people are able to cycle. The report doesn't neglect side roads, because we all recognize that there are traffic problems on side roads. There are problems of road danger on side roads. And we come up with some detailed solutions for side roads, which we believe tackles the traffic, tackles the road danger, without the need for area-wide LTNs, which have caused so many problems. The report is online together with briefing sheets outlining the individual topics, and you can read more there. But that's all for me right now, Olu.
Thank you very much for introducing the transport paper. And I think you've addressed some of the key questions that have been asked.